Hello and welcome to the Northern Myths podcast, where we explore the myths and legends of Northern Europe from an archetypal perspective. I'm Luke DeWolf.
And I'm Dan Larrabee.
Today we're continuing our series on the Kalevala with Kalevala Runo 6, Joukahainen's Crossbow. This is going to be a little bit of a shorter episode, not necessarily because of the length of the poem, but because it doesn't have quite so many distinct sections that we have to cover, kind of like the last one on Väinämöinen's fishing. That was a little bit everything was a little bit rambly, right? But this is going to be a good one, though. We've got a lot to dig into, and it's another topical, relevant poem that digs into a lot of fantastic ideas. So I'm excited for this one.
Oh, me too. It's going to be a good one. It is kind of a shorter poem, but there's a lot of interesting things going on in it that actually we'll be able to relate to things like going on today. So a lot of timeless stuff in it.
Yeah, the Kalevala has definitely been very relevant, and lots of things that we've been able to tie to things going on today, and then that's been a lot of fun to dig into for sure. It's a little different compared to our Poetic Edda material, and it's a good contrast, and definitely excited for this one. Okay, so before we get started into that, just our usual housekeeping, everything like that. First of all, thank you for listening, and if you would like to support the show, we have a few ways you can do that. The best ways, of course, for sure, are to share our episodes on social media, Twitter, Facebook. We're on Instagram as well. On Twitter and Facebook, we are Northern Myths. On Instagram, we are Northern Myths Podcast. On YouTube, we're also on our YouTube channel, we're Northern Myths. And we're also personally on Twitter, North Myth Luke and North Myth Dan. So you can get in contact with us any of those places. We love comments, conversations, everything like that, and love hearing from folks. So do get in touch, and we do our best to respond to every comment in a relatively timely manner. So yeah, definitely reach out, and please do share, like, subscribe. All those things definitely help us out. Reviews on iTunes are really big. Definitely a positive review on iTunes goes a long way to showing folks that there's people who like listening to the show and enjoy it, and it just helps us get in front of more ears and more eyes, and that's just a big help. And a couple of other ways you can support the show if you like. We have a merchandise store now through Teespring, and we've got some t-shirt designs, some mugs, things like that. Just a few things that if you want to show your support for the show, we get a little bit from every shirt or mug, so that's a great way to do that. And we also have on our website, we've got a list of recommended books, music, and that's all through the Amazon affiliate program. It's things that we find influential and useful, and I think we might update that. We've got a lot of things we want to do in the new year now, and we might make some improvements to our website. But all that is just things we find influential, or music that some of our great guests have produced that we highly recommend. And if you make a purchase through any of those links, we see a little bit of that as commission. And so again, that's just a great way to support the show if you choose. I think that's everything. Am I forgetting anything?
No, I think that's about it for the beginning of the show housekeeping.
Wonderful. Okay, and then so with that, I think we're going to dive right in. And again, thank you for listening and bearing with us as we go through all our usual ways you can get in touch and support the show if you like. Certainly appreciate the listening, though, either way. Okay, we'll just dive right in now into Kalevala Runo 6, Joukahainen's Crossbow. Going to be covering the first 22 lines. Back to the poem. Väinämöinen, old and steadfast, now resolved upon a journey to the cold and dreary regions of the gloomy land of Pohjola. Then he took his straw-hued stallion, like a pea-stalk in his color, and the golden bit adjusted, bridle on his head of silver. On his back himself he seated, and he started on his journey, and he trotted gently onward. At an easy pace he journeyed, mounted on the straw-hued courser, like a pea-stalk in his color. Thus, through Väinälä he journeyed, over Kalevala's wide heathlands, and the horse made rapid progress, home behind and journey shortened. Then across the sea he journeyed, o'er the far-extending billows, with the horse's hoofs unwetted, and his feet unsunk in water. What do you think of that, Dan?
Well, I think it's actually a really interesting description of sort of the beginning of Väinämöinen's journey into Pohjola. And if we recall from the last Runo, he had gone fishing and he'd actually caught Aino, but then because Aino had turned into a fish, then Aino escaped and was never to be seen again. And then Väinämöinen, if I remember correctly, got a message from his mother saying that he should go into Pohjola, and there he might have better luck finding a wife. And Pohjola is sort of the far off place. Like it's not necessarily like even a real place, but it's sort of beyond in the cold and dark or north. Like it's sort of beyond, right? So he's going there in the hopes of finding a wife, and he's riding his horse, and there's a lot of there's actually a fair amount of significance just in this 22 lines. One of the things that's significant is that Väinämöinen is accepting the call to adventure, and that's actually pretty huge. One, because I mean, if he didn't, like, where would the rest of the Kalevala go, right? But more seriously, you know, we're all called to adventure at different points in our life, and you know, if you reject that call, bad things often happen, and we see that in virtually every story where there is a call. So, like, if you look at Abraham in the Bible, he's called to adventure. God tells him to go out and leave his homeland, and God doesn't say go have an adventure, but that's basically what he's saying. It's like we're going on an adventure. And then on the other side, we see Aino, who was also called to adventure in her story, in the adventure of marrying Väinämöinen. But she rejects it and has to very tragically, like, I guess she does die. She kills herself, but so she submerges herself in the water and like sort of reverts back into the unconscious, and then, you know, just completely opts out of life, really. And that's so this one little thing of, you know, Väinämöinen saying, yeah, I'm going to go to Pohjola and find a wife. Like, he's sort of avoiding that fate of having to revert back into unconsciousness and nothingness. And he's saying, no, I'll go do it. And as far as him being on this awesome horse, horses are often symbolic of, you know, wealth and power, because if you own one, you obviously can take care of one, and that means you're powerful enough and wealthy enough to not just feed yourself but feed animals. Like, it's pretty impressive. And then also, more esoterically, riding a horse is often seen in shamanic journeys as something that you'd use to travel between, well, the known and the unknown. And, you know, the parts about him traveling across the sea and the horse's hooves being unwetted and, you know, his feet unsunk in water, there is kind of a magical element to that, you know, this horse isn't just a horse, it's a special horse. And you can see a lot of other mythologies in the world have place like great importance on the horse for their ability to travel sort of in that ethereal realm. For example, when in Homer's Odyssey, when Patroclus is killed, Achilles sacrifices 4 horses so that Patroclus will be able to arrive in Hades quickly and in sort of the proper splendor that he believes his lover would deserve. So it's horses are actually like a really big deal in this time frame.
Yeah, this section here gets us started, and the horse is significant for sure in the sense that I think not only what you said here about the mythological significance and of course the shamanic significance, that's a fun one that is certainly applicable to Väinämöinen. But then here, so what I have for the horse is definitely something like Väinämöinen is capable of making his journey easier by having the horse. He's able to travel without without him doing the walking. He's got a creature that would have taken a long time to master. Like this was something that wouldn't have happened for a significant part of human history, and of course a lot of the major empires of the world, they really wouldn't have happened without horses. Like the Mongols with Genghis Khan, absolutely not. Without their horses, they wouldn't have been able to get across the continent of Eurasia in a 30-year period and conquer the entire thing, sort of thing. And then even earlier, there's the idea of the Indo-European peoples in general. The thought is that they were a horse culture as well originally, and they came and overtook what was originally in Europe through their horses, which enabled faster traveling, a significant advantage in warfare, lots of big things with the horse. And so on this, it's kind of like Väinämöinen is taking advantage of a major technological accomplishment and a major symbol of wealth, as you said, Dan. And so what that shows, and I suppose I should have at the beginning said something about how the Kalevala is very, very much an episodic story. And if you haven't listened to, certainly Runos 1 and 2 are nice and important, but Runos 3 and 4, if you hadn't listened to 3, 4, and 5, sorry, that would have definitely encouraged you to, if not, go back and listen to those first before this one, but definitely go back and listen to those, and you'll get some more context regarding the whole Väinämöinen and Joukahainen Aino situation. But my point here on this is that Väinämöinen has, in all of those stories that have preceded this so far, he's represented the culture. He has represented the figure of the masculine order which the culture resides in. Even the, not sort of the, it's his poetic title, essentially. So there's Väinämöinen in his name, but he's also very, very often called Väinämöinen, old and steadfast in the translation, and in the Finnish that's Vaka vanha Väinämöinen, and that's really old and steadfast. I mean that just tells you exactly what his role is. He is the old and enduring culture as it exists, and the contrast between Väinämöinen and the youthful Joukahainen, I mean, that was made very clear back in Runo 3, that Joukahainen is like kind of this upstart who is challenging the existing order, and he gets very much, he gets put in his place by Väinämöinen. He does not succeed in overthrowing the existing culture. And then Aino was a whole other thing that we got into in much greater detail, but her symbolic significance was something like the potential of the next generation and then the culture, and even what happens when the younger generation is faced with a sort of a despair at operating within the culture sort of thing, and the negative consequences that go along with that. It was a deep few episodes. It's kind of dark, honestly, but building this all up is just to say that Väinämöinen, the culture, is using its technological resources and its wealth for a purpose in this situation. And by going out and going to an adventure after, in the previous poem, where Väinämöinen was unable to catch the love that he lost in Aino, who he caught as a fish, but then she escaped, sort of thing. And he was very, very sad and not knowing what to do, as you said. But then his mother goes and tells him, "Yeah, go off, have an adventure." And so he does. And honestly, I think that's just how he's going to reinvigorate himself, and how he's going to keep the culture from stagnating, from dying. And by using his resources that he has available, he's going to be much better off, better prepared to do that. We cover that in the Havamal, being prepared when going on a journey. And so it's all similar themes, but he's prepared. He knows that this journey into the unknown may be dangerous, but he's going to be much better off if he makes use of the technology and the wealth that he has developed to this point.
Absolutely. I think that's a great way to sort of bridge the previous poems into this one and make those connections. Yeah.
Perfect. And with that, shall we see what happens when Joukahainen comes on the scene?
Yes.
Okay. This is going to be lines 23 to 78. Back to the poem. But the youthful Joukahainen, he, the puny son of Lapland, long had cherished his resentment, and had long indeed been envious of the aged Väinämöinen, of the ever-famous minstrel. Then he wrought a mighty crossbow, and a splendid bow he fashioned, and he formed the bow of iron, overlaid the back with copper, and with gold inlaid it also, and with silver he adorned it. Where did he obtain the bowstring? Whence a cord to match the weapon? Sinews from the elk of Hiisi, and the hempen cord of Lempo. Thus at length the bow was finished, and the stock was quite completed, and the bow was fair to gaze on, and its value matched its beauty. And its back a horse was standing, on the stock a foal was running, on the curve a sleeping woman, at the catch a hare was couching. Shafts of wood he likewise fashioned, every arrow triply feathered, and the shafts were formed of oak wood, and he made the heads of pine wood. Thus the arrows were completed, and he fixed the feathers on them, from the swallow's plumage taken, likewise from the tails of sparrows. After this, the points he sharpened, and the arrow points he poisoned, in the black blood of the serpent, in the blood of hissing adders. Thus he made his arrows ready, and his bow was fit for bending. And he watched for Väinämöinen, waited for Suvantolainen. Watched at morning, watched at evening, waited also through the noontide. Long he watched for Väinämöinen, waited long, and wearied never. Sitting gazing from the window, or upon the stairs he waited, sometimes lurking by the pathway, sometimes watching in the meadow. On his back, his well-filled quiver, 'neath his arm his crossbow ready. Then he waded further onwards, lurking near another building, on the cape that juts out sharply, where the tongue of land curves outward, near a waterfall, all foaming, past the banks of sacred rivers.
So I love the line, long had cherished his resentment, because I think that exactly describes how resentment is built. You have to actually cultivate it and take care of it, because one, it takes a lot of energy to be resentful. And unless you're going to continually make yourself angry, eventually you'll kind of let it go. At least you won't think about it all the time, but it's clear Joukahainen has been thinking about it and really cultivating it. So I love that they have that in there, because it's exactly how people do things like this, where they want to go kill someone. And in the sort of symbolically, we've got sort of the young upstart who is so resentful that he wants to destroy the father culture, the father civilization. And so he's doing his best. He makes a crossbow out of, these wonderful materials. And he's got these symbols carved on them. I'm actually not entirely sure about some of them. Like at its back, a horse was standing on the stalk of foal was running. Like, these to me seem maybe that, those two are signs of wealth and power. Like, this is going to be a powerful weapon. The curve of a sleeping woman. That to me tells me that the crossbow was actually like a beautiful piece of work that, I think we can all sort of imagine sort of that delightful hip curve on a woman as she's laying on her side sleeping. At least that's what I'm picturing. And then the hair on the catch, it makes me think that, the arrows will travel swiftly and meet their mark. And then just to top it off, he puts poison on the arrows. Like, he's really aiming for death here. He's serious about killing Väinämöinen. Like, he's thinking, like, even if I just nick him, the poison will get him. Like, he's going to be dead. And I think we see something very similar, just in people who are resentful, that growing thing where they just want to destroy everything. It stops being just, oh, this person, I don't like them, to, well, I don't like this person, and I don't like humanity, and I don't like the world, so I'm going to get rid of it.
Yeah, his resentment here, he's got a lot that he could reasonably justify being resentful for. First of all, being defeated by Väinämöinen in the first place. I mean, yeah, he could be resentful for that if he didn't spend any time thinking about how it was originally his fault. And that's sort of the point here, is that resentment is a really easy way of deflecting your own faults. Like, it really is, because if it's not your fault, it's got to be someone else's. If something negative has happened to you, and of course there's circumstances, right? There's things that just happen, that, accidents and all that are just under. It can't be under your control. Natural disasters, loads of things, personal things. But in this case, Joukahainen, he went and sought out Väinämöinen originally to try to defeat him in the first place, and it was his doing that led to his defeat. He kept on pushing Väinämöinen, pushing him, and was eventually beaten, and had to give up his sister's hand in marriage in order to be saved, which, again, we go into much greater detail on what that is symbolically. But then the other part that he can be resentful for is that his sister eventually died, and she went and drowned in the lake. And of course, there's other symbolic significance to that too. But that originally stemmed from Joukahainen giving her up as a means of saving himself. And so again, that's his fault by my estimation. And yet that's something that is easily what you could be resentful for, what Joukahainen could be resentful for. So he's got plenty of this, but he's really wallowing in it. He's almost enjoying his victimhood, and he's spending time on it. He's spending time building a weapon that could take out the source of his resentment, that could take out the object that he desires to kill. He's spending time on it. All of these things. I liked what you said about what the different symbols meant, but for me, I more just looked at this as a whole, as he just spent loads of time on the craftsmanship and spent time on it, making something that would do its job. First of all, that would be very good at being a crossbow, but then he made it beautiful. He put all of his energy of resentment into this item, because that shows me that he was really not just spending time in his resentment, but he was enjoying it. He was going into the little details and like, oh, I'm going to make this look nice. I'm going to put all of my effort, all of my energy into this weapon of war, this weapon of destruction, instead of doing something else to improve his life, right? And of course, a crossbow could be used for legitimate purposes, for hunting, which was important at the time there. And so, I mean, maybe that's one of those things where you could flip that around, and he spends all this time on this rage and resentment, but he gets it out by building this crossbow. And of course, we're going to see what he does with the crossbow, but maybe that's one of those ways, you get over your anger by working on a project, something like that, spending time on something that you can put all your energy into, all your negative energy, but maybe it is actually going to be useful for something kind of in the future. This brought me back to one of the archetypal stories about resentment, Cain and Abel from the Bible. And after Cain kills his brother Abel out of resentment, his descendants essentially get the same resentment handed down to them. Not directly, it's implied, it's more like it's retaliation from different tribes and things like that, but it eventually escalates to one of his descendants is the first to develop weapons of war. And it's sort of described how tit for tat, paying a murder back by murdering 7 others and then murdering 49, et cetera, is just going to turn into a bad time for everyone. But it was also how this resentment can be channeled into some kind of weapon, some tool that is specifically for killing, for destruction, and of course, defending yourself or hunting are useful things to have back in the day, and even today. I mean, plenty of folks keep weapons for self-defense and or for hunting, or go to learn how to shoot or bow and arrow, things like that. It's sport these days to be able to do things like that. But in this case, really, I see his resentment just going into it, and he's got nothing but bad intentions here.
For sure. He was, when he attacked Väinämöinen way back in Runo 3, he was basically trying to assert himself at the top of the dominance hierarchy. And he didn't deserve it at all. I mean, Väinämöinen, spoiler alert if you haven't listened to number 3, Väinämöinen makes short work of Joukahainen. Like there's no legitimate challenge there. It's just, he goes out and wants to take out Väinämöinen. And now instead of trying to better himself and become better than Väinämöinen and work his way up the dominance hierarchy, he's almost trying to take a shortcut by making maybe a crossbow that would be at the top of the crossbow dominance hierarchy. And he thinks, if I can kill Väinämöinen, I can undo everything, and life will be better. And it's kind of throwing, the baby out with the bathwater. Like that's, and ironically, like the crossbow would also be part of the civilization and culture that was handed down to him, like through Väinämöinen, and that's what he's going to be trying to use to destroy it. It's not unlike when you see, people protesting against, the ingredients that go into their cell phones. and they're using their cell phones during the protest, and it's like, well, you're obviously kind of okay with it because you're using this product that relies heavily on whatever it is they're protesting. So
Yeah, it's funny. It definitely, there's some cognitive dissonance there. And again, I think if Joukahainen were to recognize his role and understand his responsibility, maybe he could take that into a better place. But, well, we haven't got to what exactly he's going to do with the crossbow yet necessarily. I do want to, before we move on, just a couple of definitions for some of the Finnish words here. So he made a cord from the sinews of the elk of Hiisi and the hempen cord of Lempo. And these are two kind of devil type figures today in modern Finland. And they're actually used as like kind of mild swear words. Mild. They've got strong swear words, but these are kind of more like mild. Like I think the name of the devil used to be sort of a swear word here, things like that, and it's kind of in the same vein. But they didn't used to be kind of these devil figures. That's definitely Christian influence. They used to be forest spirits. Like Hiisi was originally like a sort of spirit of the forest, like the hilly forest, and eventually kind of went to something more like the spirits of burial mounds and things like that. So kind of cool there. And Lempo was a god of love, fertility, but eventually they all just kind of got lumped into being kind of these devil type figures. And well, that's Christian influence for you, but on some of these more pagan traditions. But then, you know, Joukahainen making part of his crossbow from parts of the elk of Hiisi or the cord of Lempo, that could be two things. So either he's kind of taking the power from these spirits and kind of trying to channel them into this weapon, which would be a powerful thing, or he's trying to channel some of the energy from these negative spirits, which would also be quite something. And either one would make sense. It's likely that this poem would have been composed prior to the Christian changing of these characters, but it's possible that these details were put in after, because they eventually would have become kind of bywords for negativity or evil sort of thing. So both would make sense. And I don't know the answer to exactly when these would have been put in, but either way, that's kind of what they mean. And then Suvantolainen. Suvanto was what I found for that as far as a definition was something like the slow part of a stream, or an eddy, I think is one word for that here, like kind of the part beside a stream that has slowed down and isn't really flowing. It's just kind of there. And Väinämöinen, and the name originally also, I think we've covered it, but we didn't really go into it too much. It's kind of like from a small stream, and so this is just another by name from the same kind of natural source, essentially. And so that's what I found for Suvantolainen, as far as just that being an alternate name of Väinämöinen was what I found based on kind of the slow part of a stream.
Absolutely, and it really makes sense if you look at Väinämöinen as a symbol of civilization, that there's water, so there is sort of that unconscious thought kind of feeding it, so there will be rejuvenation and that kind of stuff, but it's slow moving, so it's not just chaos. There's a sort of almost a steadiness to the change and the rejuvenation that would come from the new water coming in, because like you wouldn't be able to symbolically like build a civilization on rapids, right? Like it would just be too crazy. This is like, no, like we can handle this. This is something that we can work with.
Yeah, it's a good name, and it's good that we can make some symbolic sense out of it. And there we go. That's some of the definitions here. Shall we move on and see what Joukahainen's going to do?
I think so.
Okay, this is going to be lines 79 to 128. Back to the poem. And at length, one day it happened, very early in the morning, as he turned his eyes to westward, and he turned his head to eastward. Something dark he spied on ocean, something blue upon the billows. Is a cloud in east arising, or the dawn of day appearing? In the east, no cloud was rising, nor the dawn of day appearing. 'Twas the aged Väinämöinen, 'twas the ever-famous minstrel, who to Pohjola was hasting. As to Pimentola he journeyed, mounted on his straw-hued courser, like a pea-stalk in his color. Then the youthful Joukahainen, he the meager son of Lapland, spanned in haste his mighty crossbow, and he aimed the splendid weapon at the head of Väinämöinen, thus to kill Suwantolainen. Then his mother came and asked him, and the aged one inquired, "Wherefore do you span your weapon, bending thus the iron crossbow?" Then the youthful Joukahainen answered in the words which follow, "Therefore do I span the weapon, bending thus the iron crossbow, for the head of Väinämöinen, thus to kill Suwantolainen. I will shoot old Väinämöinen, strike the ever-famous minstrel, through the heart and through the liver, twixt the shoulders I will shoot him." But his mother straight forbade him and dissuaded him from shooting. "Do not shoot at Väinämöinen. Do not Kalevalainen slaughter. Of a noble race is Väinö. He's my sister's son, my nephew. If you shoot at Väinämöinen, and should Kalevalainen slaughter, gladness from the world will vanish, and from earth will song be banished. In the world is gladness better, and on earth is song more cheerful, than to Manala if banished, and to Tuonela's darkest regions."
So we definitely find out what Joukahainen wants to do. He wants to kill Väinämöinen and like fill him with arrows. I love the just like how many different spots on Väinämöinen he wants to put an arrow. It's pretty like you can actually feel the resentment and just how much he hates him. But then, his mother comes by and says, "Hey, you don't actually want to do this because, gladness from the world will vanish, and from earth will song be banished." And I think she's being quite literal. Like the things that we enjoy by living in a civilization, we're able to enjoy them because so much of our like livelihoods and safety is taken care of by being in the group. And if you take that away, all of a sudden we have to start worrying about survival and all those little things that society just kind of takes care of for us. Like it takes away sort of that leisure time that we generally have now, and makes it like everything is now about survival if you take out society. But whereas with society, you can have art, you can start thinking about the bigger questions. I mean, if we weren't in a society, Luke and I certainly wouldn't be spending our time doing this. We would probably be out hunting things and, making sure that someone isn't going to come by and try and steal our stuff and, kill our loved ones and all that kind of stuff. Like it makes the world a lot safer having the protection of society. And that's what the mother's trying to tell Joukahainen, is that like, you don't want to get rid of all of this. Like, yes, you're angry with Väinämöinen, but if you just kill him, like you're wiping everything away. And there's still so much goodness that Väinämöinen provides that you just don't want to do it. And that we see a lot of that today, where people want to overthrow the sort of the ruling ideas of the day. And it's like, okay, like there are problems for sure. No one's debating that. But getting rid of everything, like things were way worse before these ideas. Like they've gotten a lot better, and we can keep getting better. There's lots of room for that. But don't just flip the table, as it were. Like there are things you can refine it. Don't get rid of it all.
That's right. And his mother is definitely reminding Joukahainen that he's connected to everything here too. And it was interesting. I thought it was, so if Väinämöinen is Joukahainen's mother's sister's son, let's just kind of draw that out in the air there a little bit, then they'd be cousins essentially, is what Väinämöinen and Joukahainen would be, and they would be of the same generation as well too, by that measure, which is interesting because first of all, Väinämöinen is portrayed as old and Joukahainen is portrayed as young. But it's interesting here though, because if there is the one that is representative of culture and success, then the resentment from someone kind of the same generation who maybe thinks he should be sort of on the same level, it's interesting. That said, I think the point here is that it's the connection. It's the connection between the culture and the younger generation. It's the idea that they are related. It's not that the younger generation is coming into the world, by magic. They have come in through descent from their parents and their parents' parents and all of their ancestors who have been a part of the culture and have participated in it by virtue of being able to procreate. They have succeeded long enough anyway in producing a child, and they have survived against all the forces that nature and chaos wants to come in and destroy them. They have managed to survive in the culture, in the order, long enough to produce a child. And yet Joukahainen thinks he knows everything. He thinks he knows what best to do. He thinks that his way of doing things is going to be better than Väinämöinen's way of doing things, and he can beat him. But that didn't happen. Väinämöinen, as the symbol of culture, took care of it. And now Joukahainen is definitely resentful and definitely intends to kill him. But he's going to be killing what he is connected to. He's going to be killing what he is descended from. And by doing so, I mean, that's really just a case of he's going to shoot himself in the foot if he shoots Väinämöinen. Essentially, he's going to be crippling his own ability to survive and thrive. And his mother saying that the song is going to be banished into the underworld, because that's what Manala and Tuonela are. They are the underworld. Those are just two names for their underworld. Yeah, it's true. It's going to go into, it's going to be inaccessible in day-to-day life. If all it is going to be, if all of life is just bent on survival and ensuring the survival of the tribe for one more year, which in fairness it still was up till not even all that long ago, but the implication is that there was still time for song and enjoyment and gladness. And the implication of what Joukahainen would actually do if he destroyed Väinämöinen, because on a story level, if he kills one person, I mean, that's not great. That's not great. And he's portrayed as, the ever famous minstrel or the immortal bard. It has been pointed out to us that is maybe a light, not necessarily error, certainly an inaccuracy might be true here in the translation, where the original word tietäjä is more literally, that means kind of knower, but referred to as something more like a magician sort of thing at one time and on one level. That said, if he is the bard or the minstrel or the magician, whatever, if he's responsible for music sort of thing, at least that going out of the culture would be literally true. But then it's sort of, what is Joukahainen going to accomplish by destroying on a symbolic level the whole culture? How is that going to happen? That's hard to do. You know what I mean? That's not something. The culture is resilient. The culture is resilient to all but the most drastic means of destroying it. And I don't know that Joukahainen is necessarily capable of destroying the culture just by killing Väinämöinen, just by shooting some arrows. what exactly would that accomplish? And I don't know. I think we have to move on to see it. But if you had anything else,
Well, I was just thinking maybe that's one of the reasons why he poisoned the arrows, is that there has to be a single blow isn't going to destroy a culture, but you can certainly influence a culture and poison it so that it deteriorates. There are some like terrifying videos on YouTube of a former KGB agent who his job was to poison the culture, and he infiltrated like 1960s coffee houses in like California or something, and made friends with a whole bunch of artists there, and sort of fomented, revolutionary thought and things that would go against the sort of the typical American ideals of the day. And he eventually, I can't think of the word for when you defected. That's the word. He defected because he had sort of accomplished his mission, and his next task was to kill all these people that he had become friends with. And he's like, no, I can't do that. And so he defected and sort of let I don't know, the authorities know of his plan. A very similar thing happened actually in Germany in World War I. They had this person locked up in jail who was spreading these harmful ideas, at least harmful to the Kaiser and the German society. And when they were fighting with Russia, they were like, you know what? Let's just let this guy go out into Russia and let him, spread his thoughts there and see what happens. It's certainly better than, having him here in jail. And this person's name was Karl Marx. And then you have the Bolshevik Revolution, and like things go crazy. So it is that kind of, and maybe this might offend some listeners, I don't know, but like I don't have a problem saying communism is kind of a poisonous, or not kind of, it is a poisonous idea. 100 million people killed because of it. And I'm not going to get into like, oh, it wasn't real communism. No, it was. But yeah, no, like there is this idea that there are things that you can poison the culture with so that it will die.
Yeah, well, and I mean, wasn't that also it was Lenin as well, that they let him pass through their territory? He was in Switzerland, and they let him travel through Germany into Russia, and he would have been, I think, under normal circumstances, he would have been arrested if he had tried to travel through Germany, sort of thing. But they just kind of let him through and facilitated him getting across the borders and everything like that. And that really is just how the revolution went down. And then it ended up being that when German soldiers had contact with Russian soldiers, because things were kind of different. They often, I think, in Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, Blueprint from Armageddon specifically is where I'm getting this, is he talked about how there would be crews of people kind of cleaning up at night and bringing bodies back and stuff, and there wouldn't be shooting happening a lot of the time there. It was just kind of, it was different. It was not the same way that war happened in say World War II or more modern things like that. It was a rough time, but there was plenty of occasion to have some contact, sort of thing, and communist ideas started to permeate into the German army. I forget the exact way it happened, but it was because the armies were in contact and allowed to communicate, sort of thing. And it's like, comrade, why are you fighting for this emperor who doesn't care about you, sort of thing? Like, here, have some communism. And I think they started to realize, so first of all, when Russia pulled out, they voluntarily pulled out and signed treaties and everything, and which eventually didn't hold up because the Germans eventually lost World War I. But, well, the German army realized what was happening and noticed that these units were not doing so good, but they also needed the manpower out west, and so they transferred all the troops out to the west, and they started to get into the minds of all the units and soldiers out on the Western Front, and that may or may not have contributed to degradation in performance as the final offensive, which turned into a rapid retreat on the German side, happened. And yeah, it's just it poisoned them, and it's possibly, I mean, it's certainly one of those what ifs, right? Like maybe Russia never really lets up until and Germany doesn't kind of let that front get taken care of quick enough, and they still lose, sort of thing. But still, some really nasty things happen, and maybe Russia was still ripe for some kind of a revolution because their emperor was not so good. Tsar Nikolai was not so good at the whole ruling a country sort of thing, and there was some stuff leading up to revolution. It was almost inevitable that something was going to happen, but it wasn't for sure going to be communism until Germany let Lenin kind of come through, and all the fun factional stuff that goes on with that. It's a fun period of history, but it in real human terms, it had some drastic effects.
For sure. It's like Russia was sort of like waiting for the spark, and Lenin was that spark that, and it could have been like, anyone else with sort of any other idea, but Lenin was I guess the right guy at the right time for revolution. Yeah,
exactly.
That's fascinating.
Good period of history, and fun to make connections here. Well, and I mean, it eventually it affected Finland, right? And that's how they gained their independence. Was in 1917 was when the Bolshevik Revolution happened and all that, and Finland. I'm fuzzy on the details necessarily, but they declared their independence, but then they had their own really, really bloody civil war between the communists and the Reds and the Whites, and the Whites won. The Whites, the anti-communists, more, I won't call them democratic because they weren't properly that, but they turned into a democracy for sure, and they did their job surviving until World War II started to happen, and well, we know how that went too. But that was how Finland got its independence, and they had their own civil war as a result of all that. So big period of time with some implications. But obviously, Kalevala was composed before all that, and this whole idea of resentment was. Well, they knew something about it, and that's kind of cool. And well, maybe it would have been good for some folks to do some reading from the Kalevala. But anyway, shall we move on?
Yes.
Okay, this is going to be lines 129 to 182. Back to the poem. Then the youthful Joukahainen paused a moment and reflected, and he pondered for an instant, though his hands to shoot were ready. One would shoot, and one restrained him, but his sinewy fingers forced him. And at length these words he uttered, and expressed his own decision. What if twice from earth in future every gladness should be banished? Let all songs forever vanish. I will shoot my arrows heedless. Then he spanned his mighty crossbow, and he drew the bow of copper, and against his left knee bent it. Steady with his foot he held it. Took an arrow from his quiver, chose a triple feathered arrow. Took the strongest of his arrows, chose the very best among them. Then upon the groove he laid it. On the hempen cord he fixed it. Then his mighty bow he lifted, and he placed it to his shoulder. Ready now to shoot the arrow, and to shoot at Väinämöinen. And he spoke the words which follow. Do thou strike, O birchwood arrow, strike thou in the back, O pinewood. Twang thy best, O hempen bowstring. If my hand is leaning downward, let the arrow then strike higher. If my hand is bending upward, let the arrow then strike downward. Quickly then he drew the trigger, shot the first among his arrows. Far too high the shaft flew upward, high above his head to skyward, and it whizzed among the cloudlets, through the scattered clouds it wandered. Thus he shot in reckless fashion, shot the second of the arrows, Far too low the shot flew downwards, deep in Mother Earth 'twas sunken. Earth was almost sunk to Mana, and the hills of sand were cloven. Then he shot again a third time, and the third shaft, straighter flying. In the blue elk's spleen was buried, under aged Väinämöinen. Thus he shot the straw-hued courser, like a pea stalk in his color. Through the flesh beneath his shoulder, in the left side deep he pierced him.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about just the structure of the poem and then get into the symbols. You might have noticed that Väinämöinen started riding a horse at the beginning, but is now riding an elk. And you might wonder, at what point did the horse transform into an elk? The thinking is that Elias Lönnrot found more than one version of this particular poem, and one had a horse and one had an elk, and he just kind of mashed the poems together so that you have an elk at the end. But for those of you who've seen an elk, like, they're also big animals that you can ride. And as well, they were you could herd them as well. So there's still that idea of wealth and power. So there's not much difference in the symbolism between elk and horses. So it's an interesting detail, but not super important. The change, but just to be aware of it, that sometimes these things happen when poems are collected and looked at and that kind of thing. But we have just this incredible outburst of resentment from Joukahainen, and yet he's sort of unable to hit his mark for the first few shots. Like, he's clearly not as skilled at using the crossbow as he might be, and it takes him a few times to hit anything. And then when he does, he actually misses Väinämöinen and hits the elk. So he's certainly not he's not hitting culture and poisoning culture or society, but he is hitting. He does seem to be hitting it in the the wealthy, powerful part, and so there's disruption, but not like a complete overthrow. So I imagine Joukahainen would be happy that he hit something, but not quite as happy because he didn't hit Väinämöinen.
Yeah, well, and I mean the fate of Väinämöinen here is still not completely decided, but yeah, he missed Väinämöinen and shot his steed, regardless of whether it was a horse or an elk. And yeah, I think that's the idea, is that the material wealth can be affected, right? And I mean, this is what happens with acts of terrorism, right? For example, where it's say the World Trade Center. I mean, these are huge symbols of, essentially at the time, that was the symbols of wealth and trade and even globalization on another level. And that was as symbolic targets. I mean, they were the right targets for essentially destroying and crippling the symbols, the very epitomization of trade and wealth in the United States. And I mean, there were major effects from that, obviously, that we're still feeling today. But even though people die, and that's tragic in acts of terrorism and things like that, it doesn't necessarily destroy the culture. It doesn't necessarily destroy the nation. I mean, in Paris, for example, in France, those brutal attacks a few years ago, I mean, the results have been things like there was martial law for quite a period of time. I think it still is at the time of this recording, still in martial law, where the army has the right to do a bit more, and then they can arrest people a little bit more freely, things like that. But the funny thing, though, is that so far has not really done a whole lot to take down the culture. And France is still a very integrated nation where they have a major emphasis on being French, and they really don't care what someone's background is or anything like that. As long as you're French, essentially, and that really hasn't shaken that. They're a very tolerant society, and that's wonderful. And the effects of having some terrorism, while tragic, doesn't seem to have affected daily life. I would say it's kind of ironic that what seems to have actually more of a a potential for bringing down the culture as an apparatus is these gilets jaunes. I don't speak French. Their protests, these yellow vest protests that just developed from truckers protesting high costs of fuel that were being risen by taxes, meant for the environment, sort of thing. Which again is not something like. Maybe it's one of those things that we need to have some solutions for, and the Paris Accords being named for Paris, right? Like that, so that puts some pressure on France, sort of thing. But the average person is just saying, hey, well, we're not gonna take this, and we're gonna actually do some protest, and that might actually have some potential to bring down the government of France. But my point is actually more like some material wealth is destroyed in terrorism, and effects lingering on in terms of maybe more security, things like that. Maybe that's sort of like, it takes a little while for things to get back to normal the way they are. But it doesn't destroy the culture completely. Like 9/11 in the US was a major event, of course, and the effects are still being felt today. But the culture hasn't really changed. It's not completely different, and it's certainly not destroyed. And that didn't happen. And that's interesting to me here. So the symbol of wealth, of technology and all that can be destroyed. Those material goods can be destroyed, and the material things that make life a little bit easier can be destroyed. But maybe not necessarily the culture itself. Maybe that lives on unless there's something deeper, something poisonous. But that didn't hit Väinämöinen from what we can see here.
No, for sure. It's funny, when I read that part, it reminded me of those protests a few years ago in New York, like the Occupy Wall Street, that it was disruptive for sure, but I don't think anything's changed really. Like, but it was people who were, resentful of the banking system and all that kind of stuff. And so they wanted to do something about it. And I'm not going to pass judgment on whether or not the banking system needs to be rejigged. Well, it probably does. I mean, but it's complicated. So it's a complicated thing to take apart and put back together in a way that doesn't wreck something else. So that all this stuff's always more complicated than you would like it to be, right? There's no easy fixes, but yeah, it didn't. It certainly disrupted things, but it didn't. I don't think there's been like a lasting change. So it was. It reminded me a lot. Just they kind of hit the elk, but the culture itself, the civilization, kept marching on.
Exactly, and where I went with that as well is that very specifically, I think this has more in common with school shooters as kind of a phenomenon than it does necessarily with terrorism, which seems to be very politically motivated. Not seems to be, that's the definition. But school shooters, for example, the Columbine shooters, I've got a quote from them, and I might be paraphrasing a little bit, but they said something like, "The human race isn't worth fighting for, only worth killing." And when Joukahainen says, "Let all the songs ever banish, I will shoot my arrows heedless," like, he doesn't care. They don't care. They want destruction. And I mean, they've gotten it into their heads that the world is better off destroyed. The world is better off if they do as much damage to it as possible, to humanity as possible. And that resentment is that's at the core, right? That resentment is something that needs to be dealt with before it gets to this point, because, and it's worth mentioning that this seems to be the way that men deal with resentment very specifically, because you don't really see women go this direction. They go Aino's direction, and they maybe don't even get into like kind of resentment as a per se concept. they maybe go more into just straight despair in the world, and that gets into, they decide not to participate in it, but they don't go towards it violently. Honestly, we've talked about this before. The combination of testosterone, resentment, and just in general male nature, that is not a good combination. And what we have talked about before is that helping men to harness their aggression and their testosterone, I mean, things that basically you can't help, honestly. Like, it's biology. What you can help is having some way of channeling that, which some of the best ways are, for example, competition, or helping to learn a skill, or the things about masculinity which maybe today sometimes are portrayed as toxic. You can flip that, and it's not toxic to play sports, or to work on building a skill or things like that, and channel that energy into something productive. And Joukahainen certainly did that. He channeled it into something productive, but then he took that and decided to kill with it, make it destructive. He could have done something productive with that energy, with that resentment. And it, I think really it boils down to, if we take the idea of resentment and really just encourage it to not be resentment anymore, but opportunities for improvement and for advancement, and ways you can do better. Like, if Joukahainen just saw this as instances where he failed, but he could succeed if he tried it again, or he improved himself, well, then you wouldn't have him shooting at Väinämöinen and potentially causing significant destruction.
For sure. I think in males, like, resentment is sort of that magic poison that really, if you want to talk about toxic masculinity, that's the toxic part. That's that resentment that things aren't working out the way they were told they would, or, they're often like too nice for their own good, that kind of thing, where they're not directing their testosterone or their spiritedness in the right way. And so they end up getting like all these feelings of like wanting to compete, but not getting a reward and all that kind of stuff. And so they're like, okay, well, screw it. I'm gonna flip the board. I'm gonna take it out everything. It at the time of this recording, the latest Jocko podcast, which we've talked about quite a few times on our podcast because we're both big fans. He just covered a book called Panzram, and this guy, he was alive like in the turn of the 20th century, so like 1900s, and he was executed at, I think, like 38, and by the age of 38, he had killed a whole bunch of people, burned down a whole bunch of things. But the real number that's impressive is that he had raped like 1,000 men, at least by his own count. And the reason being, in the book, there's quite a few quotes because it's kind of a dictated autobiography. He's telling, there was a guard that he surprisingly kind of made friends with in jail when he was on death row. And the guard was like, kind of got him to tell him his life story so he could write this book. Because like this guy, Karl Panzram, was so filled with resentment and hatred. And the quotation from the Columbine shooters that you read, that's basically like lifted directly out of what Panzram was saying, where like he hated everyone, wanted to kill everyone, and just he literally wanted to destroy the world and throw it into like a third world, or I guess like a world war between World War I and World War II. He was going to bomb like a ship from Britain and make it look like the U.S. had done it, but he got captured before he could pull that off. The other thing about Panzram that's interesting, he was 6 feet tall and was often sentenced to hard labor. So he was like 6 feet tall, 190 pounds of just like twisted steel. Like he was incredibly strong. So he had that testosterone coursing through his veins, along with the actual ability to carry out his resentment, because he could overpower anyone he came in contact with. And like some of the stories that he tells, it's literally terrifying. I definitely recommend listening to the podcast, with the caveat that like you kind of have to steel yourself a bit for some of it, because like it's nuts. But it's almost unbelievable the lengths that he's gone to with his resentment. And the other thing is that he never takes responsibility for any of his crimes. It's, oh, he literally says, I had a bad childhood, and if I'd been raised better, I wouldn't have done all this. And it's like, well, you still did all of this, and like no one was forcing you to. But yeah, so that's sort of that feeling of resentment that grows to wanting to destroy the world. Like that's a real thing. That's not just things you see in movies with like bad guys who want to take over the world. Like, no, it's a real thing. And we see it in these sort of microcosms where people do the best they can in their small world to destroy it.
Yeah, well, the Panzram story is just crazy. I mean, hearing about that for the first time was nuts, and I don't think either of us had heard of Panzram for the first time through Jocko, but yeah, it's quite the podcast, and I think it's a caveat for almost every single one of Jocko's episodes that you're going to be in for a tough time, a tough listen, but it's worth it, because he goes into some of the darkest stories of humanity, and really shines a light on it, and how bad things can get. And him doing that is a very good thing, I think, because it shows that it's possible. The funny thing about Panzram saying, blaming it on his childhood, though, I think the one place where you could validly say that it's the responsibility of someone else is the parents to their child. There's definitely an element of, they're the ones who maybe could have made a difference in order to have him not go down that path. And certainly he is responsible for his actions, and that's true. Not taking anything away from that, but had he been better socialized or better brought up, then yeah, maybe that wouldn't have been the thing he would have considered. And actually my point was going to be here something like the way of dissuading that in men would come through parents, would come through society, of sort of helping young men to channel their feelings, maybe their frustrations with inadequacy, because it's hard to be successful. It's hard to be the top of the dominance hierarchy, whether it's high school or whatever. It's hard to do that. And helping men channel their energy into something where they can succeed, that's hard to do. Sometimes it's hard to find those interests and ways to succeed. But I think as soon as you get some success, then they're not going to be nearly as much of a risk anymore. And that's the trouble here, right? Is that you mentioned that Panzram he had the ability to execute his dark desires, and the product of his biology, testosterone and all that. He had the ability to do that. Guns make almost anyone able to do that, as long as they get a hold of them, or knives or whatever, weapons of any kind. And that's really the hard part, right? Is that, in the states where there's the Second Amendment and everything, the right to bear arms and all that, it still is the case, though, that if the wrong person gets a hold of a gun, they can cause some serious damage, and it's a hard question. How do you screen for that? How do you make sure that you don't get guns into the wrong hands, right? And I'm not saying I'm pro gun control or pro Second Amendment or either of those things. I'm more just observing that this can happen when the combination of a resentful young man filled with testosterone and resentment gets a hold of a gun, then things like Columbine happen, or Parkland, or that shooting at the elementary school in Connecticut. They happen, and they're terrible. And it does seem to be that constellation of things. Like it's going to be a young, resentful male doing this, and really, I think as a society we need to focus a lot of energy on helping young men not get to that point. And it really isn't like a suck it up situation either. It's not like that young men have to pull themselves up. It's like that requires societal support for sure in order to help them achieve and channel something worthwhile so that it doesn't get to this point. And again, I'm not taking their personal responsibility for that away, but I'm saying like that's something that we could do to make this sort of thing less likely, less often, because they're tragedies and we don't want more of them.
Yeah, actually, I was just thinking, I can't remember his name, Elliot Rogers or something. He killed a whole bunch of men who were dating women, I think in like San Diego. And you can at the time, I don't know if it's still on the internet, but you could read his manifesto, and it was just like the most resentful thing. Like it could have been written by the Columbine people or Panzram. Like they say all the same things, right? And he was resentful that, women didn't like him. And so he wanted to kill women and the men that they went out with, that kind of thing. And yeah, it's, and again, like you're saying, like it's 100% their fault. But there might be a way to alleviate it or at least mitigate it so that there's maybe more options for, young men to maybe get like a positive reinforcement for turning their testosterone and desire to be, in the dominance hierarchy, like reward that somehow so that they get that first win. And it's like, oh, okay, this feels pretty good. I'm going to keep trying. And, they won't take it so personally if they lose like next time, because like, oh no, I'm still capable of this. I just have to learn. And then it goes from there. But yeah, no, there's definitely something I'll say in the, not to get too meta, but, in Western society that, like particularly North American society, that I'm not going to say causes men, but it can, there's sort of like an easy path for men to go down and cause havoc like this with a gun. Because other countries have, as lax regulations around guns, or even more like, I think some other countries actually like basically give you a gun at a certain age, or at least it's well known that at a certain age, or it's traditional that you get a gun and go, training for a weekend, that kind of thing. But they don't have the same amount of this type of like resentful, destroy the world attitude. And I think there's something in the culture that there's a poison in the culture, not unlike what Joukahainen was trying to do with his arrows, that is leading to this. Now, I don't have any answers for it, but I have noticed that, when you start taking out variables that are present in other countries that don't have this issue, then you start getting to the hard questions of like, well, crap, okay, what is it in our culture that does that? And that's a monumental question, because everything is so intertwined. And if you start pulling on one string, what does that do to everything else? There's no easy answer.
No, there isn't. And I'm just thinking that as well, by my saying something like that, the culture as a whole needs to help young men to achieve and things like that. And maybe on a symbolic level, that's also saying something like Väinämöinen could have done something to get involved in Joukahainen's life on a level where it's like, yeah, maybe Joukahainen isn't going to try and defeat him. He's going to try and live up to him, to his example, sort of thing. And maybe Väinämöinen going off and kind of doing his own thing is while leaving Joukahainen to his own devices, sort of thing. And again, not to not to get too meta in the story. Obviously, it's not just symbolism. There's some character to it and things like that, and maybe that wouldn't make sense for the story necessarily. But it's still like if Väinämöinen had been there and been a steadfast figure in his life, or Joukahainen's father or something like that had helped him and helped him channel his resentment, well, maybe none of this would have been happening.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Like it's a crazy problem to try and solve. Like, and I mean, we've been trying to solve this type of thing like forever. Like, go back to like ancient Greece, and like Plato's Republic is basically a treatise on how do we direct young men so that they're not trying to kill people.
Yeah, if we go back all the way to there, yeah, there's got to be something to this, I think. Shall we see what the result is of all this?
Yes.
Okay, we're going to the end here. This is going to be lines 183 to 234. Back to the poem. Then the aged Väinämöinen plunged his fingers in the water. With his hands the waves he parted, grasping at the foaming billows. From the blue elk's back he tumbled, from the steed a pea-stalk color. Then a mighty wind arising raised upon the sea a billow, and it bore old Väinämöinen, swimming from the mainland further, o'er the wide expanse of water out into the open ocean. Then the youthful Joukahainen uttered words of boastful triumph. Now, thou ancient Väinämöinen, never while thy life endureth in the course of all thy lifetime, while the golden moon is shining, walk in Väinölä's fair meadows or on Kalevala's broad heathlands. May you toss for 6 years running, 7 long summers ever drifting, tossed about for over 8 years on the wide expanse of water, on the surface of the billows, drift for 6 years like a pine tree, and for 7 years like a fir tree, and for 8 years like a tree stump. Then the house again he entered, and at once his mother asked him, "Have you shot at Väinämöinen, slaughtered Kaleva's famous offspring?" Then the youthful Joukahainen answered in the words which follow. "I have shot at Väinämöinen, and have o'erthrown Kalevalainen, sent him swimming in the water, swept him out upon the billows on the restless waves of ocean, where the waves are wildly tossing, and the old man plunged his fingers and his palms amid the waters. Then upon his side he tumbled, and upon his back he turned him, drifting o'er the waves of ocean out upon the foaming billows." But his mother made him answer, "Very evil hast thou acted, thus to shoot at Väinämöinen, and to overthrow Kalevalainen of Suvantola the hero, Kalevala's most famous hero."
So we have Joukahainen again with incredible resentment. I'm basically cursing Väinämöinen, to toss for 6 years running, 7 long summers ever drifting. Then he got like 8 years being tossed about. Like, he's really like, I think the idea behind it is like forever he's going to just be tossing and turning and being, he's going to be out at sea, and it's just going to be awful. And in some ways, that's what can happen to a culture if it gets disrupted in a big enough way. Things can, the cultures themselves can go into like the underworld and have to find, the treasure or free the maiden or something like that, and then come back out and be powerful again and forthright. And I think that's what, maybe not what Joukahainen's aiming for, but I think that's what we're being led to, is that, Väinämöinen is now in the ocean, and that's very different from just going like to Pohjola, which is, it's the unknown, and it's in the north and all that kind of stuff. And that, that's, but it's kind of manageable because it's still on land, and humans are land creatures. We can go in the water, but we're not great in the water. Whereas this is like, no, everything's been washed away. Like, oh my goodness, we are no longer in control. Like, you can swim in the ocean, but it's hard. Like that, like open ocean swimming isn't just swimming it, because you're going up against like ocean currents, and that like, that's no joke. So he's basically thrown Väinämöinen into like the utmost chaos. And so I guess, in the next Runo, we'll kind of have an idea of what happens with that. But, Joukahainen's mother very rightly points out that, this was evil. Like there was goodness there that we all benefited from, and you've gone and just thrown it all away. Like that's a big deal.
Exactly. And that's important. It's important to be clear about that. It's important to be clear that these acts are despicable, and that when this resentment eventually manifests itself in violence, that is completely wrong. And then, you have the whole thing of not popularizing or valorizing, not that we valorize, no, that's the wrong word. Not making these people famous, not sharing their names, things like that. That's important too, because infamy can be just as big of a draw as fame. That said, it's important to be clear that what's done here is very evil. That's the word, right? And the condemnation of that, I think it's good to be clear that we as a society do condemn that, and we're not trying to develop this in young men, and we're not trying to put young men into a position of doing that, or even by, say, having guns available, is that really trying to create any sort of violence or anything like that. Like, as a society, as a culture, we're not trying to do that, and we condemn these things as evil. We're also not necessarily doing everything we can to prevent it from happening, because the Joukahainens, they're responsible for their actions, but condemning after the fact doesn't change that a tragedy has happened. And if anything can be done before the tragedy happens, we should be doing that. That's what I think here. And the result, yeah. So Väinämöinen, the culture is at sea. He's almost back at square one. When he was born in the ocean, and he sort of swam around in a sort of a primordial way at the time, which was symbolic of his development and formation and things like that, and it made sense. But here, he was traveling out to the unknown, but that's different from being thrown into chaos. Being thrown in involuntarily is very different from approaching the unknown voluntarily, and that's the hero's journey, right? Is to venture into the unknown and do something great, and to bring back a cauldron so everyone can have mead or something like that, like Thor did in Hymiskvida, just as an example of a hero story we've covered. But getting thrown into the unknown, that's completely different. So we'll see what happens next time.
Yeah, it struck me, like, at the beginning of the Runo, you have Väinämöinen traveling on his horse/elk. In like all his glory, right? Like, he's Väinämöinen on his amazing horse, going into the land of the unknown. Like, he's very much in control and has everything pretty much taken care of. And it's like, they even talk about like the horse trotting slowly. Like, there's no real like urgency to it. Whereas like being thrown into the ocean, well, holy crap, you better like take care of that right now, or else you'll drown. Like, yeah, it's funny. It was part of me almost wonders if there was almost like a willful blindness there. Like, oh, we're going into the unknown today. It's going to be a wonderful day. And then it's like, no, we're going to throw you into the real unknown. And then into the ocean he goes.
Well, Väinämöinen is going to have to prove why he is the hero, and this is actually the end of this Joukahainen cycle as well. That's generally understood to be 3 to 6. Runo's 3 to 6, and well, now we're done, and yeah, the next one we're on to the next phase of the Kalevala. So this is definitely the closing of the chapter of the story of Väinämöinen and Joukahainen and Aino, and I mean it was quite something. It was a journey for us, for sure. For me, it was like, wow, dealing with such deep issues and really having to think for a long time about unpleasant things, unpleasant ideas. The whole Fate of Aino episode, like really, that was a brutal one. And I mean, I encourage you to listen to that if you haven't. But it's a hard listen, and it was hard to read and to prepare for. It was hard. But we've really dug into some super relevant things and some themes that just cut to the core and give us so much to think about what we could do differently, or what as a society we could do to help bring up the new generation in a way that's not going to throw them into despair or resentment. And the continuation of despair is death, and the continuation of resentment is tragedy, and they're neither one is good. But there was some understanding that needed to be addressed and was not being addressed properly, and Aino and Joukahainen are the victims of that on the one hand, but also they chose not to participate in the culture and embrace it, and well, they suffered for it. And now Väinämöinen is thrown out into the unknown. His elk / horse is presumably dead, and he no longer has the benefits and the advancement, everything that his technology and his wealth would bring him, right? So we're gonna see what he's gonna do next time.
For sure, it's interesting. Just listening to you talk, I recently watched a documentary on Netflix about prisons in the U.S. and they're talking about, there's a program in some prison called like Shakespeare Behind Bars, and they get inmates to perform Shakespeare. And what ends up happening is that the timeless truths in Shakespeare about human nature, not unlike the timeless stuff we're reading in the Kalevala, it kind of gives the inmates the words to figure out like why they're so resentful and did the crimes, but also they can then actually like empathize with the people that they've victimized. And in 20 years, I guess the recidivism rate, so people who have gone to jail and then come back out, but then go back to jail. That's what recidivism is. So you want a really low rate of that. That means it's working. It's something like 5%, whereas like the rest of jail programming in the US is like 80% recidivism. Like if you go to jail once, you're very likely to go back. And it was like, yeah, if you get people in touch with these timeless truths, you can really you can change them. You can, or at least get them to understand things and then life better. So yeah, just an interesting thing, reading this and watching that, and it was like, crap, there's something here. There's something solid.
Would you say that maybe they found out what myth they were living and they decided they didn't want to go in that direction?
That is a very good observation, Luke. Yes, I would say that's what I would say. They realized the myth they were living.
Well, and with that, I think we are just about to wrap up here.
Yeah.
And well, we basically covered our usual ending already with the find out what myth you're living, but we'll say that again just to wrap up. But before our usual housekeeping and all that, we did want to point out a particularly fantastic YouTube comment that we appreciated very, very much, and hopefully you don't mind the shout out here. So this was from the account was under it. The display name was Pete Hill, and the comment went like this: "Thus begun the North Myth podcast to release these episodes. Episodes on Kalevala, episodes on the land of heroes. Long their episodes did last, whole episodes dwelling on the Runos. Long lasted these story sessions, these tellings of Kalevala." And that was just really cool to see.
Yeah, that someone like took the time to like mimic the way that it's written or translated in English, and that I was definitely tickled by that. So thank you very much for the creativity and the comment. We appreciate it a lot.
Very much, and it's certainly right that our episodes are long, and hopefully I hope you took the time because you enjoy our long episodes, and listening to what we're doing and all that is something enjoyable, and of course we spend the time because we think we're talking about things that are worth talking about. We think the Kalevala is worth talking about, the Poetic Edda, and the themes and the directions that we go. Maybe we spend a lot of time down the rabbit hole sometimes, but it's always fun to talk about, and we're certainly learning a lot. But this particular comment we really enjoyed, and maybe we'll we've been getting a lot of good comments and reviews. Maybe we'll start reading some of our favorites on future shows. So if you'd like a similar shout out, maybe that's one way you can do that, is if you want to leave a comment or a review, and tweet it to us too. So make sure that we find it, because other than on, say, iTunes, like you can see different countries' reviews and things like that, and we've had a few from different countries, but the one we'll look at primarily is the US. That's where you get where we have most of our listener base and everything. But if you're not on the US iTunes platform and you leave us a review, tweet it to us too, because we'll definitely be able to see it for sure, because we can't check everything, and there's some services that do that, but they're all for money, and so that kind of is what it is. But let us know if you give us a review, and we'll tweet out some of our favorites and maybe even mention them on our show.
Totally. And bonus points if you can do it in some sort of recognized like poetic meter. Like if anyone can do like iambic pentameter, like wow, that's eternal respect for that.
Absolutely. So thank you to Pete Hill. This was I won't say like it's hard to say this was like the best comment we've ever received, but definitely one of the best, definitely one of the coolest, and we both were like,
yeah, it was yeah, it definitely put a smile on my face. Yeah, when I read it, I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. Like, one, I don't think I could have done that well. Like, yeah, no, it was great.
It was really something. So thank you for that. That was really cool. Made our days. And I think that was yesterday at the time of recording, or the day before, or something like that. So yeah. This was very recent. And speaking of something else that happened recently, the day before the recording of this episode, Finland's national junior hockey team won the World Junior Hockey Championship, third time in 6 years. So congratulations to the Finnish national hockey team. If you're watching on YouTube, you've seen that I've been wearing my Finland national team jersey this entire time, and my wife and I had a good time watching Finland win, and we would have been perfectly fine with them winning second and everything like that too, because they exceeded expectations this year. But it was fun to see them win, and that's the one instance where I break from patriotism with Canada and all that, is I just seem to like Finland and their hockey and everything like that. So that's just me being me, but congratulations to the Finland national team there.
I feel like that's almost as close to heresy or being a traitor in Canada that you can get, cheering for the other hockey team. Oh.
Well, I still want Canada to win and everything like that, but when Finland wins too, it's
good.
Exactly. So that's just me. And I think with that, that's going to be it for us for today. And if you'd like to reach out and get in touch with us, we always love that. As we mentioned, we're on Twitter, Facebook at Northern Myths, Instagram, Northern Myths Podcast, on YouTube as well. We're on YouTube, and that's a great way to leave comments for us, is on YouTube. You can go to the specific episode and leave a comment there. We got all our stuff on YouTube there. And we always appreciate a subscribe, a like, sharing. Of course, we always appreciate that. And yeah, that's just some of the best ways you can help spread the word. If you've enjoyed this episode, if you are enjoying what we're doing, always appreciate that. You can also support the show a little more directly if you would like. We have a merchandise store with some t-shirts and mugs and things like that. We'll probably add more in the future, but we'll have a link to that below here. And we also have a page of recommended books and music on our website, which has some books that we find important and influential for the show, and a lot of great music from guests that have been on the show that we are personally quite into. And if you make a purchase through any of those links, it's through Amazon's affiliate program, and we see a little bit of the sale from that. And so that's just a great way to support the show if you're going to be doing some shopping anyway, whether it's for our stuff or for completely unrelated things, honestly. So, if you'd like to support us, that's one way you can do it. Other than that, am I forgetting anything, Dan?
Well, I think there is one last thing. And as we've already discussed, it's probably one of the most important things. And that's to go out and find which myth you're living.
This has been the Northern Myths Podcast. Thanks for listening.